Lakuta Sichos Chelek Yotes, Sukkos Aleph, a very beautiful Sicha where we experience the fusion of Nigla and Chassidus. We're going to begin with a question Al Pi Nigla about a Sukkah She'ula, a borrowed Sukkah, why it is okay to use it on Sukkos. And after a brief explanation according to Nigla, we're going to go through a more lengthy explanation according to Chassidus, according to Pnimis and Yanim. Along the way, we're going to get a beautiful glimpse into the difference between Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkos, and ultimately it'll boil down to a bir al pi Pnimis and Yanim, an explanation according to Chassidus as to why we can use a borrowed sukkah, but we can't use a borrowed lulav on the first day of Sukkos at least. The Gemara is in Sukkah. The Gemara says in Masechta Sukkah, Tanya, learned in a Brayse, Rabbi Lezer, Eimer, Rabbi Lezer says, just like one cannot fulfill their obligation on the first day of Sukkos with their friend's lulav, with another person's lulav, because it says, it says you should take for yourself on the first day an esrig and the lulav, etc. It says the word lachem, which from this we learn misha lachem, it has to be yours. You have to own it, and therefore you cannot be yetzer with someone else's lulav. Kach, similarly, a person cannot fulfill their obligation with another person's sukkah. Because the pasuk says, Chag HaSukkos tasa loch shivas yamim. You should make for yourself a sukkah for 7 days. Loch teaches us misha loch. It has to be your sukkah, and therefore, if it's another person's sukkah, even if they give you permission to be in it, you cannot fulfill your obligation of dwelling in a sukkah on Sukkos. The Chachamim say, they argue with Rabbi Lezer and they say, even though we know that you cannot be Yetzer on the first day of Yom Tov with another person's lulav, nevertheless, a person could fulfill their obligation with another person's sukkah, because it says a pasuk, all the citizens of Yisrael should sit in Sukkos. The fact that it says Kol Ezrach Yisrael teaches us that all Yidden are worthy of dwelling in the same sukkah. And therefore, it doesn't matter whose sukkah it is, as long as a person is sitting in the sukkah, they're yetzer, their mitzvah. That's the shita of the Chachamim who argue with Rebbe Lezer, and the Chachamim say you could be yetzer the mitzvah of sukkah in another person's sukkah. But Rabbanon frag the Gemara, hi loch my darshibe. So what do they do with loch? Why didn't it say Chag HaSukkos tasa loch? So the Gemara answers, mi boye le'lemuti gzula. This is there to exclude gzula. A stolen sukkah, you cannot fulfill your mitzvah in it. You cannot fulfill your obligation. Avol she'ula, but if it's a borrowed sukkah, ksiv kala ezrach, it says kala ezrach, which teaches us that you could fulfill your mitzvah in a borrowed sukkah. The halacha is with the Chachamim, and the halacha follows the shita of the Chachamim. As chach means nidyetze b'yam tov rishon from Chag HaSukkos midalad minim shulim, that although the halacha tells us you cannot fulfill your obligation, at least on the first day of Yom Tov, with borrowed dalad minim, with the 4 kinds, with the 4 species, lulav, esig, hadassim, and aravis that are borrowed. Mishum debinam lachem, it has to be lachem, you have to own it, and borrowed is not yours. Is aber basuke anders und es jetzt mit der sukkah shula, sukkah is different, and you can fulfill your mitzvah with a borrowed sukkah. The Rabbi is going to suggest 3 ways to understand this according to halacha. Why is there a differentiation between lulav and sukkah? The first 2 ways the Rabbi himself is going to refute based on the wording in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. And then the third one is the one that we're going to conclude with. Here's the first one. We learned the Pashtus as mashma, as the tam farvos the Chachamim halten as mizyetz b'sukkah shula. Seemingly, we understand that the reason why the Chachamim hold that you could fulfill your mitzvah with a borrowed sukkah is var the limud from pasuk kol ezrach b'Yisrael v'gemer melamed shekol Yisrael ru'im leishu b'suk achas, that the limud that we learn, that which we learn from the pasuk, that everybody is worthy of sitting in the same sukkah, is megale as tasaloch meint nit as dar zayin shalach, teaches us that when it says chag sukkah tasaloch, this teaches us that it does not need to actually be yours. It's only there to exclude a stolen sukkah, but you do not need to own your sukkah. That's one way. That's one distinction, one way of understanding the difference between lulav and sukkah. That lulav, it says, you need to own your lulav and asrik. And sukkah, even though it says sukkah is tasalach, you do not need to own your sukkah. However, the Alter Rebbe says like this in Shulchan Aruch. Loch mishalach leimer shetei hasukah shalach v'lei shel chavercha. Even though the Torah says Chag HaSukkah is tasalach, which teaches us that it has to be yours and it can't belong to someone else, af al pi nevertheless, a person could fulfill his mitzvah in a borrowed sukkah. Because since a borrowed sukkah means he is going in with permission, it's as if it's his sukkah. And the reason it says mishalach is to exclude a stolen sukkah. But if it is borrowed, it's as if it is yours, and therefore you can fulfill your mitzvah in it. So from here we see very explicitly as that also by sukkah, like by lulav, lach teaches me that it has to be yours. Und von deswegen, nevertheless, is men yetz mit a sukkah shula, we could fulfill the mitzvah with a borrowed sukkah for a mashula hariki shaloi, because a borrowed sukkah is as if it's his own. So, unlike the way we wanted to learn it first, that sukkah does not need to be shalach. Clearly, from these words in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, lach does mean shalach, and a sukkah has to be yours. And the reason why you own your own sukkah, why you could be yitzah mitzvah in a borrowed sukkah, is because borrowing it is as if you own it. From first day, but according to this, we have to understand. From here we understand that the fact that you're yitzah with a borrowed sukkah is not because kol ha'ezrach is coming with a special limud to exclude, to differentiate from lulav and say that shula does work here as an exception, but nor, that's not why. Nor val shula hariki shaloi. The reason, according to the Alter Rebbe, that a borrowed sukkah works is because a borrowed sukkah is as if it's his own sukkah. So this raises the question: so why does the same reasoning not work when it comes to lulav? If something that I borrowed is halachically considered for this time as if I own it, then why can't I say the same thing with regards to lulav and say that if I borrow a lulav, it's as if it's my own, and I can be yitzhak mitzvah with a lulav? So that's the question. That is the question that we're going to be addressing throughout the Sikha. Why by sukkah, by a lulav, do I say, the Chachamim teach us, is the halacha, that on the first day of Yom Tov at least, you cannot be yetz with a borrowed lulav, because it has to be yours, and borrowed seemingly is not yours. And by sukkah, even though we say sukkah has to be yours, nevertheless you could fulfill your mitzvah with a sukkah, with a borrowed sukkah, because because a borrowed sukkah is as if it's yours. Beis. So in Sif Beis is going to suggest another explanation how to differentiate between sukkah and lulav. And he's going to suggest that maybe there's different levels in shaloi. There's different levels in what it means yours. There could be something that's partially yours, something that's totally yours. And maybe sukkah only needs to be partially yours, and lulav needs to be totally yours. That's the next suggestion. We can answer as together from shaloi gufa da, that within the characteristics of shaloi over here is an art of chilukim afifos shaloi. We can differentiate on how much it has to be shaloi. Basuk is the pasuk kol ezrach v'gerim megala as is maspik eicha klan nedargin loch mishalach. By sukkah, the pasuk of kol ezrach reveals to us that a smaller level of shalach is sufficient, and therefore in velche shu'eich shu'ulevet nichlol chachas is nit shaloi mamish, and that would include a borrowed sukkah, even though it's not shaloi mamish, but it's somewhat shaloi because he has permission to be there, and therefore sukkah works even as a borrowed sukkah. But when it comes to lulav, where we don't have a limud of kala ezrach that allows a minimal level of shalach, is there pirush when ulakachtam lachem misha lachem mamish? Over there we learn that it has to literally and completely be yours. Afu ständig even shalachem, a complete way of shalachem. Versus mamayid lulav shol, which excludes a borrowed lulav. So that's another suggestion. That it's true they both need to be shalach, they both need to be yours. But there's a difference. By sukkah, we see from kala ezrach that as long as it's somewhat yours, is good enough. By lulav, it has to be completely yours. And maybe that's the reason why there's a difference in the halacha between the sukkah and the lulav that are borrowed. This too is going to be refuted also from the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. Aber von Lashon Alter Rebbe in Avaita dikin sifis mashma, but from the wording of the Alter Rebbe in a later sif in the same siman as shula basukah. His mashma is understood as shula basukah is in the Megiddo for shalei mamash. We're going to see that the borrowed sukkah is also considered shalei mamash. It's not a lower level of shalei; it's a full-fledged shalei. This is the lashon of the Alter Rebbe. If a person builds a sukkah on someone else's property without permission, so it's considered a sukkah gzula, even though the sukkah itself is his own, but the boards, the parts of the sukkah are his, but it's built without permission in someone else's property. So even though you b'diavad, you are yotze the mitzvah. Lechatchila, one should not dwell in a sukkah that is in someone else's property. Because it's not considered shalei mamish. It's not considered completely his. The Torah says it has to be yours. You can't compare it to she'ela, to borrowing a sukkah, which the person gave him permission to use it, and therefore it's considered shaloi mamish, it's considered completely his. So that's why she'ela works. But if you're building the sukkah in someone else's property, it's not shaloi mamish, and it's not therefore not lach mishalach, it's not yours, and therefore lachatchila, you should not do it. Zetman derfun, so from here we derive as mitasukkah shul is when yetsa nidr farbas basukkah is genug when it's nit shaloi mamish. That the reason why you yetsa your mitzvah by a borrowed sukkah is not because it's by sukkah a minimal amount of shaloi is sufficient. Narval shul is takaz evi shaloi mamish, but rather the Alter Rebbe says that shula is shaloi mamish. It's literally completely his. The reason why you could be yotze your mitzvah by the borrowed sukkah, even though the sukkah has to be your own, is because if you borrow it, it's as if it's your own. Is hadra kushyan leduchta. So now this brings us back to our initial question. Why by the dalad minim? Why by the lulav is she'ela is a borrowed lulav? Excluded because it's not shalachem, it's not yours. If it's borrowed, if we see by the sukkah that shu'ulari kishalei, that something that's borrowed is considered shaloi mamish, is considered completely his own. This is our question. Why can I be yotze my mitzvah with a borrowed sukkah and not be yotze my mitzvah with a borrowed lulav? Ken men zogin. So we might be able to answer, and here the Rebbe is going to give a third suggestion into understanding the difference between sukkah and lulav. The first was that by sukkah it doesn't need to be shaloi. The second was that it does need to be shaloi, but it doesn't need to be the same level of shaloi, because from kol ha'ezrach we learn that a minimal amount of shaloi suffices. Here he's going to have another more revolutionary approach. As the uftu von limud kol ha'ezrach, that what do we gain from the limud of kol ha'ezrach? Nit as basukkah is maspik euch wenn es nit in ganzen shalach. Not to tell me that sukkah is enough, even if it's not entirely shalach. Nor verkehrt, but the exact opposite. As in sukkah hat in sich azag geder, was mit zadem wird shula basukkah shaloi mamish. Sukkah has a characteristic. Sukkah has something about it that transforms a borrowed sukkah into a shaloi mamish. Not to say that you don't need to be shaloi, just the opposite. It needs to be shaloi. But sukkah has something that lulav doesn't, that transforms a borrowed sukkah into an owned sukkah. And let's explain this. How do we explain this? What is unique by sukkah? that it turns a borrowed sukkah into an owned sukkah. Since he's lending him the sukkah, it should be similar to, or exactly, punktvi. Punktvi, it should be exactly like his permanent dwelling for the rest of the year. Which is the whole characteristic of a sukkah, that it replaces his permanent dwelling. Unlike lulav, which lulav, the owning the lulav is just a detail. The mitzvah of the lulav is to use it, to shake it. The fact that it has to be yours is only a detail in the sukkah. Is only a detail in the lulav. But by sukkah, the whole definition of sukkah is that I'm living in it, that it's my dwelling. Is there bargain ba'if the shalei mamish? Therefore, by sukkah, where the whole definition of sukkah is that the person owns it. When a person lends him a sukkah, he's lending it to him to own it. It is on that condition that he's lending it. In other words, when a person lends a lulav, he lends the other person the use of the lulav. And therefore it's only using the lulav, it's not his own lulav. Therefore he can't be Yotzei's mitzvah. When a person lends another person a sukkah, he's lending him the ownership of the lulav, of the sukkah. Again, when a person lends a sukkah to another person, he's lending him the ownership of the sukkah, because that's what sukkah means. Sukkah means that I live in it. If I live in it, it's my dwelling, it's mine. So when a person lends another person a sukkah, he's lending him the bailus. He's lending him the ownership of the sukkah. And therefore, it becomes shaloi mamish, because that's what the person gave him. The person didn't just give him permission to use the sukkah, he gave him permission to live in it as if he owns it. And therefore it's a much greater level of shaloi, because the person gave him the sukkah to own it. And that's why by a sukkah she'ula, it's kashaloi mamish, it's literally as if he owns it, and therefore he can be yotzei his mitzvah in a sukkah she'ula. This is the extent of the brief and concise explanation that the Rebbe gives al pi nigla. And from Seif Gimel and on, we're going to go into the world of Pnimi Yisrael Yanim, the world of Chassidus, and going to see an entirely revolutionary and different explanation al pi Chassidus that at the end will bring us back to this nigla question to differentiate between lulav and sukkah, why a lulav, a borrowed lulav cannot be used for the mitzvah, and a borrowed sukkah could be used for the mitzvah. We can add on to this and make it more geshmak according to Chassidus from Pasuk as Kol Yisrael from the Pasuk Kol Ezrach we learn that all Yidden are worthy of dwelling in the same sukkah mitzad dem ilui fun sukkah, because of the greatness of sukkah, the quality of sukkah, that an alle Yidden is ached in ein mitzias, all Yidden become one in one entity. Bees as called used to all the point that they all are deserving, they all are worthy of dwelling in the same sukkah. When high time, and is for this reason is ba sukkah eich shula kishalei mamish. By sukkah, even a borrowed sukkah is as if it's his own, as we will explain as we will now explain at length. And here goes. This is explaining Chassidus in a Pirush HaPasuk B'Kesel Yom Chagenu, explaining the pasuk in Tehillim, where it says B'Kesel Yom Chagenu, the concealed, the covered up, on the day of our celebration, as the Inyan Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Zayin Zei Behelim, those things that on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are accomplished, but in a concealed way, B'Kesel, which means covered up. They are revealed. L'yom Chagenu, on the day of our celebration, Chag HaSukkos, Sukkos reveals the great accomplishments of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Based on this, we'll be able to understand the difference with regards to lachem between sukkah and lulav, whether you can fulfill your mitzvah with a borrowed one or not. By first prefacing an explanation, how these things are accomplished in the concealed on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Once we get the picture of how it works Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and we then apply it to Sukkos, we'll get a whole new understanding of the lulav and the sukkah. It's been explained at length in the references. Look at the Sukkos Chelek Daled, very popular, a very famous Sikha in Chelek Daled, as in Teichen from Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippurim, in the theme of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippurim. There are three levels, one above the next. Aleph, There's three concepts with regards to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, one above the other. Aleph, the mitzvahs hayom. Number one, there's the mitzvah of the day. And this is both Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We're lumping the two of them together as one. In the Avodah of Bakesa, which includes Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we have three things, three concepts. Number one is the mitzvah of the day. But Rosh Hashanah, mitzvah is Tkiyah Shofar. Rosh Hashanah, it's the mitzvah of Shofar. Yom Kippur, the mitzvah is Hataynis, the mitzvah is Tshuva Vidui. Yom Kippur is the mitzvah of fasting and doing Tshuva and Vidui, confession. Base, the next level, does was a zayin from the Aseres Mitzvah, the fact that Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are part of the Aseres Mitzvah, which means the fact that they have a tshuva component. One component is the mitzvah of the day. Another component is the aspect of tshuva. Because tshuva is hecher von mitzvahs. Tshuva is higher than mitzvahs. Und der Riber can sie misaken sein, das was mir verfällt in der Arbeite von Kiyama mitzvahs, which is why he can rectify that which a person is lacking because of the lack of doing mitzvahs. Tshuva can fix it. Something that's bigger than something else can fix that which is broken. So the second component is tshuva. Gimel, they're toichin atzmi von the tag, the days themselves, the definition of the days. Which is hecharich von tshuva, which is even higher than tshuva. But Rosh Hashanah, die bakashos Hashem und aveda von tamlichuni aleichem, bakasho und aveda machte sein dem Eibishter als Melech. And Rosh Hashanah, the theme of the day is the Eibishter's request and the aveda of the Yid to crown the Eibishter as king. The day itself that atones, the day of the day of atonement. But the was die Darge von Kapara is hecher von der Kapara shel Tshuva, which the atonement that comes from the day of Yom Kippur is greater than the atonement that comes through Tshuva. Tshuva was the second level. This is the third level. We're not looking at what the person is doing during the day, so to speak, the mitzvah of the day or the Tshuva of the day, but we're talking of the day itself and what it consists of. So we have the mitzvah of the day, you have Tshuva, and you have the essence of the day. So that's the first breakdown, because we're going to use the same breakdown of three concepts. We're going to use it again and again. And it's good, I made a chart, as I've been doing lately, so you can follow through these three levels as they go through various different ideas. We're going to have the same three concepts, but this is the basis of them. There's the mitzvah of the day, there's the aspect of tshuva, and the essence of the day itself. In die drei Inyanim werden herausgesagt die verschiedene Eifane Haiskashlus Vaisachtus verlieten mit den Eibishten. In these three levels, these three concepts will also express three different ways or expressions of the connection and the unification of the Yidden with the Eibishter. Ein Eifen is one way of connection between the Yidden and Hashem, as Yidden seien Azevi Kiviyachal Abezunde Metzias. The Yidden are Kiviyachal, a separate entity. There's Hashem and there's the Yidden. Two entities. Nur sie verbindet sich mit der Lukus, and the two separate things connect together. The Yid connects to Hashem. Was in dem Eifen, in this manner, darf der Verbund und Ichud sich uftan, this connection and unification has to be accomplished by und uizdriken durch, and express itself through un in epis, and in something. It has to be accomplished through something, and it has to express itself in something. What is this something? Durch kiyum mitzvahs, through the fulfillment of mitzvahs. Was Yidden nehmen auf sich dem El Malchus Shemayim, Yidden accept upon themselves the yoke of heaven, und sie seien mekayim d'gzeres hamelech, and they fulfill the decrees of the king. This connects them with the king. So that's one way of connection. In dem gufa is the atifre reifen. In this concept itself, when you see these two separate things that are connecting, when they're connecting through mitzvahs, there's really a deeper level in that. The pnimi is the kiyeskashles von Yidden mit den Eibishten, the deeper connection of Yid with Hashem, was is nit abhängig in kiyum mitzvahs, which is not dependent on the fulfillment of mitzvahs. Und das drückt sich aus in der Tnuah von Tshuva, and this is expressed in the approach of Tshuva. As a filu, when a Yid hat sie von sich chas v'shalom haragenommen mit dem El Malchus Shemayim, und even when a person throws off the yoke of heaven and transgresses the will of Hashem, he is upset about it and he regrets it, and wants to rectify it. He does tshuva. So the fact, so he's not connecting through doing something because he didn't do the mitzvah, but there's still a feeling of connection. He feels bad about what he didn't do. So that feeling is a feeling of connection, and it's in a way it's higher than mitzvahs, because he didn't do the mitzvah. It's deeper. The very feeling in his gut that he feels bad that he didn't do the mitzvah, that represents a connection to Hashem. But this still is connected to mitzvahs. He feels bad that he didn't do a mitzvah. So it's still connected with mitzvahs. Aber echt der Reifenais Kashrus. Chos is hecher und tiefer von der Verbund durch mitzvahs, though it is higher and deeper than the connection that comes through mitzvahs. Hat es forta shaychet zu kiyum mitzvahs. It's still somewhat connected to mitzvahs. Der Verdruss und Charotte in Inyan HaTshuva is doch auf dem, was hat nicht mekayim when the mitzvahs nebishten. The disappointment in himself and the regret that he has is coming from the fact that he did not fulfill the mitzvah of Hashem. And therefore he decides from here on to carry out the decrees of the king. And therefore, since this connection also expresses itself in the following the Eibishter's decrees, haste es doch, as there is noch ametzias bifnei atzmei, was folgt und verbindt sich mit den Eibishten. So this implies that he is still a separate entity that is just carrying out the will of Hashem, similar to what we said before about mitzvahs. And therefore, even though it's a deeper connection than mitzvahs, it's still not a full-fledged oneness, because it's still another entity that is fulfilling the decree of the king. The highest level of his kashrus is Yisrael, is when Yidden and the Eibishter are one thing. Yidden are inherently one thing with Hashem. Und der Verbund sagt sich heraus in der Bakasha von HaKadosh Baruch Hu und der Avodah von Tamlichuni Aleichem. This connection is expressed in the Avodah and in the Eibishter's plea of Tamlichuni Aleichem, crown me upon yourselves. Das was Eden seinen Me'oirer und Pöyel as der Eibishter soll ehren Melech Diber sei, the fact that the Yidden awaken and accomplish that Hashem should be their king. And he explains in the next two paragraphs why that is. What is the connection between Tamlichuni Aleichem and Kula Chad, this connection where it's not two separate things, but it's inherently one unit that is connecting the Eibishter and Yidden. These guys, das von Eden mit Nebischen durch Teiro Mitzvahs, oder afilu durch Tshuva, in the first two levels, where you're connecting through a mitzvah or even through Tshuva, is dafke nach dem, even Nemt and Nebischen Notz Melech, can only begin after the Eibishter is accepted as king. Was dem und Shayach der Inyan von folgende Melech. Then it's possible to carry out and listen to the king. Tshuva tanaf nit folgen, or to do tshuva for not listening, but das verbindet sich mit dem Melech, and then they feel connected to the king. But this only can happen after there's a king, and the king is their king. They can then listen, or not listen, and do tshuva for not listening. Eider aber der Eibishter Kiachal HaMelech. Farin uftan dem Tamlichuni Aleichem, before the Eibishter becomes king, before the Yidden accomplished Tamlichuni Aleichem, coronate me as your king. Was macht, as es fällt zu Yus, dem Inyan HaMelucha. Was to leave them betten didn't as the David says what causes that the Yidden should ask the Eibishter become our king? Is as their far was they seinen beetzem in Zachmat Elokus. It's because in truth they're one thing with Elokus. And therefore they can't exist without a king. And therefore they come Tamlichuni Aleichem. So the fact that the Eibishter says Tamlichuni Aleichem, and the Eibishter and the Yidden crown the Eibishter as king, this expresses the fact that they can't be without the Eibishter as a king. They're connected, they're inherently one with Hashem. And therefore the only thing they can do is coronate and make Hashem as their king. So therefore, Tamlichuni Aleichem expresses the idea of Kula Chad. So in the three things that we had mitzvahs, tshuva, and Itzumoy Shel Yom. Mitzvahs represents the connection of the Eibishter, where there's two separate entities, but through mitzvahs they can connect. Tshuva represents a deeper connection, but it's still two entities that are connecting through tshuva. And Tamlichuni Aleichem, which is the Itzumi Shel Yom of Rosh Hashanah, represents the Kula Chad, the inherent oneness of Yidden and the Eibishter. So we had the three concepts in Hashanah Yom Kippur. We had the three concepts as they are seen in the relationship and connection between a Yid and the Eibishter, or Yidden and the Eibishter. In Siv Dalid, he is going to say that because of this, we find sometimes differences within Yidden in how they fulfill their mitzvahs. Because we're talking about Yidden being a separate entity from Hashem that connects through mitzvahs, therefore that separation brings that the way a Yid fulfills a mitzvah will be different in one Yid from another Yid, because everyone is a separate entity, and therefore they express themselves in their own way. But in Tamlichuni Aleichem, in the Kula Chad, in the oneness, over there, everyone is equal. Siv Talmud. This will explain to us why when it comes to the fulfillment of mitzvahs, we find differences in the manner of fulfillment between one yid and another yid. Similarly, with regards to tshuva, though the differences are smaller, but yet there are differences with regards to how one yid does tshuva versus another yid does tshuva. Not so when it comes to the idea of tamlichuni aleichem, of crowning Hashem as king, that in the talking chilukim zwischen Yidden, there are no differences between Yidden. In the parentheses, is going to give an example, and then in the next, and then in the hemshech of the Sif, he's going to explain it better. Like the way we would see by the coronation of a human king, as in the moment of the coronation, which is being brought about by the acceptance of the people. The great officer of the king and the simple person stand with the same bittul, with the same humility and the same acceptance of the king. Not so is after the king is already crowned. And after the king gives decrees, then there are differences amongst the people of the land of how they fulfill. Some will do a better job at it, some will do not so good a job. There's an idea of a sar gadol, there's an idea of ishpashot. Some are greater officers that are at the beck and call of the king at every moment. There's the ishpashot that minds his own business in his own place. So there's differences. In the moment of the Achtara, everyone stands in awe, in bittul of the king. Once the king becomes king and starts ruling, then there become differences. Similarly, in the idea of Tamlichuni Aleichem, everyone is the same. When it comes to Kiyum HaMitzvahs, or even when it comes to Tshuva, there are differences between the Yidden. And here he explains, it's Mamshech. Kiyum HaMitzvahs, wie bald sehr echos kashrus ist beefen as Iden, wie sie fühlen sich als besondere Sache, verbinden sich mit den Ebersten by mitzvahs, because the quality of the connection, the idea of this connection is that they feel separated, and then they connect through mitzvahs. Their father is their kiyum mitzvahs and kabbalas eil by jeden einem leit sein besonder even madrege atem tzis b'vnei atzmei. Therefore, the fulfillment of the mitzvahs and the kabbalas oil, the acceptance of the yoke of heaven, is going to be by each person on their own individual level. Mitzvahs in this context represent the individuality of Yidden from the Eibishter, and therefore the individuality of Yidden from each other. I'm my own person, and therefore I do the mitzvah the way, according to my personality, according to my character, according to my level that I'm on. In Avedis HaTshuva, was kommt mitzad a tieferen Verbund, welcher wird nicht aufgetan durch Chemitz zu Peil. When it comes to Avedis HaTshuva, which, as we said before, is a deeper connection that we have with Hashem, that is not based on mitzvahs, is in dem Unterschied zwischen ein Yid und zweiten. There isn't that big of a difference between one Yid and another. Even that das can aufgetan werden like as we know that tshuva could be accomplished through a thought. In one moment, in one instant, you could do tshuva. So a fleeting thought is not going to be so different between one person and another person. You say, I'm sorry. You think to yourself, that moment of regret, that moment of tshuva is not going to be so different between one person and another person. So there isn't such a big difference. But there still are differences. First of all, he's doing tshuva on certain avedis that he did. And where is he returning to? To his own source, to his own place of origin, which is different than the other person. But in them, Alam is in the avedis that he did, and where he's going to, Yidden are the two people, and will be different one from another. So even though there isn't such a big difference, because the idea of tshuva is very similar in every person, but nevertheless there still is a differentiation, like we said before with regards to tshuva, that the iskashrus is a separate entity, but yet it's not as separate as mitzvahs. Also in this idea, tshuva is similar amongst Yidden, but nevertheless, it is not exactly the same. In Tamlichuni Aleichem, when you get to the third level, which is Tamlichuni Aleichem, Vibalda das nimmt sich der Fun, was Eden seine Be'etzem Kula Chad Mikutsha B'richu, since it's coming from a place where Yidden are one with the Eibishter, is Geshevis, is Nishayach Zuvananda Teilen Zwischen mit den Eibishter, just like you can't differentiate between, in this context, between Yidden and Hashem, as they came in the Mechalek, that just mit den Zweiten. Similarly, you can't compare, you can't separate, you can't differentiate between one Yid and another Yid in this manner of connection to Hashem. In them, all Yidden are one entity, one inherent being, who has his talking in his chalkus that is beyond division. So, in these three levels, not only do we find that they express different relationships with Hashem, but also the way we see it, the similarity or the differences amongst Yidden will be on three levels. When it comes to Tamlichuni Aleichem, everyone is the same. You're talking about a oneness. Therefore, just like you can't differentiate between the Yid and the Eibishter, you can't differentiate between one Yid and another Yid. When it comes to Tshuva, so Tshuva itself is very similar across the board, but nevertheless, there's still going to be a differentiation, a distinction in each person based on the Avedis that the person is doing Tshuva for, or the return where he's going. And then when it comes to mitzvahs, since mitzvahs represent the Yid as an individual entity from Hashem, therefore every individual is going to express themselves in their own way. So that's the third column, so to speak. That's the third way of differentiating these three concepts. Mitzvahs hayom, tshuva, and itzumei shel yom. Totally two separate entities that are connected through mitzvahs. Two separate entities, but the connection is much deeper. One entity, Yisrael b'tzvirichun kul achad. And then when it comes to the differences, by mitzvahs, there's every Yid is different. By tshuva, they're the same, but not exactly the same. And by tamlichuni aleichem, everyone is 100% equal. In Seif Hey, he's going to say that since we're going by Kesel Yom Chageinu, we're going from Rosh Hashanah to Sukkos, instead of looking at these three things in Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur themselves, let's look at them in a more overall picture across Tishrei. That these three levels will be expressed, one in Rosh Hashanah, one on Yom Kippur, and one on Sukkos. Sifei. Even though we find all the three things both by Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Mitzvahs hayom, they each have their own mitzvah. And Tshuva, they're both part of Tshuva. And Itzumei shel yom, they both have a definition of their day, either Tamlichuni Aleichem or Itzumei shel yom Mechaper, Bichlolis, Oberu, Begoli, in a more general sense, in a more revealed way, is yet der fun Zeifar, bunden mit einem von die drei Yom Tevim. Each of these three things will be connected with one of the three Yom Tevim, V'chedesh Tishrei, of the month of Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippurim, and Chag HaSukkos as follows. Rosh Hashanah steht begolui, das was heißt der Reish 5 Jahr, siz man den Mann von Achtaras Melech. Rosh Hashanah, what is the revealed element of Rosh Hashanah? The fact that it's the beginning of the year, the fact, the time of the crowning, the coronation of the king. As the Rasag writes that the most important, the first and primary idea with the mitzvah of Shefer is the fact that we are crowning upon us the Creator. So the main and most revealed aspect of Rosh Hashanah is the coronation of Hashem, the Tamlichuni Aleichem. B'yom Kippurim state begoli does what says the Yom not Yom Tshuva, the Yom Keitzu Mechilo Slicha. Yom Kippurim, what's the most revealed aspect of Yom Kippur? The fact that it's the day of Tshuva, the day of forgiveness, or as it's known in English, the day of atonement. After the transgressions of going against the will of the king. Nachmer, afilu darini von Itzumei shel yom. Was liegt durch die Iskasus Atzmes zwischen mit Neibishten und Ches Hecher von der Iskasus durch Tshuva, even Itzumei shel yom, which is really the third level. The level that expresses the essential connection, the inherent connection of a Yid and the Eibishter. Is out in der Inyan von Mechaper, who Kishma Yom Kippurim, even Itzumei shel yom is about forgiveness and atonement. So Yom Kippur, what is the most important, most revealed aspect of Yom Kippur? Forgiveness. The forgiveness that comes from Tshuva. Chag Sukkos is this man when Yidden and Megoli are eingetan in Kiyum mitzvahs. Sukkos is the time when Yidden are mostly engrossed and involved in doing mitzvahs. Sukkah, Netilas Dalet Minim, when it's Asuk in the mitzvahs, Fun Bald Nochem Kippurim, the people are involved in mitzvahs. Ukishmei Chag Sukkos, the name of the Yom Tov itself, it defines a mitzvah, Sukkos. So if we were going to break down, and from this point on, we're going to be going the other way. In other words, till now we started with mitzvahs, then tshuva, then tamlichuni aleichem, or itzumi shel yom. Now we're going to go the other way. We have Rosh Hashanah is tamlichuni aleichem, Yom Kippur is tshuva, and Sukkos is mitzvahs. Sorry, I jumped ahead myself. Now we're going to go to Sivav. And in Sivav he's going to say that just like, even though we just said that it's that Bechlolus, it's Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkos, but just like Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, they each contain all three levels, so too it must be that also Sukkos contains those three levels. So we had it in Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. We had it in the Skashrus of Yidden with the Eibishter. We had it in the differences between people when it comes to fulfillment of mitzvahs. We had it in the overall month of Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkos. And now we're going to see these three ideas in Sukkos itself. Since everything that happens in the concealed on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is revealed on Sukkos, is moved on Sukkos, is Johnny's Askus and mitzvahs. It's understood that even though we just explained in Sif Hey that Sukkos is the idea of mitzvahs, in these mitzvahs of Sukkos, we are going to be able to express, we're going to see these three concepts that we've been talking about till now in the mitzvahs of Sukkos themselves, also those ideas that are really begolui on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we're going to see them in the mitzvahs of Sukkos as well. Just like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, there's the essence of the day, and the idea of tshuva, and he explains it over here, very interesting. Before he says the third inyan. He says, it's hinted in the words of Chazal, 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So this is a very interesting expression, because technically there's only 7 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. There's 10 days that are inclusive of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Nevertheless, the way Lashon Chazal use is Asara Yamim Shebein Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which means that on one sense, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are part of the Aseres Mitzvah. On the other hand, there are days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur that are the Aseres Yemei Tshuva, and they're different from Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. That's what he explains over here. It says, the says the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is an atel from Aseres Mitzvah. On the one hand, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are part of Aseres Mitzvah. Ubiyachad Mizeh, that is the Mitzvah. That's why Hecher for the Inyan Tshuva, plus in the Asara Yamim. On the other hand, they're higher than the idea of tshuva. There's days that are between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur themselves rise above those days. So you have the essence of the day, which is Yom Kippur, as it's higher than tshuva. Then you have the fact that it's part of a Seis Tshuva, the fact that it is the inyan of tshuva. Then and then there was the third idea, the mitzvahs of the day. So just like by Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, you have these three ideas: the essence of the day, the idea of tshuva, and the mitzvahs of the day. Similarly, we're going to find with regards to Sukkos, because the pasuk about Sukkos says like this: the pasuk is mitarid the mechag. The pasuk describes the Yom Tov. On the 15th day of the 7th month, there's the Yom Tov Sukkos, 7 days. Chag HaSukkos tasalach shivas yamim. You should make Sukkos for yourself 7 days. When Azayich by the mitzvah when you shiva the Sukkah, also the mitzvah of dwelling in the Sukkah, state by Sukkos stays for shivas yamim. Nit ondaiten dikados and yamim yichot mitzad atzmai. So the important distinction, because you're going to see later with regards to lulav how it's different. It says it doesn't say that these are special days during which you eat in the Sukkah, dwell in the Sukkah. These days are special because they are the Sukkah days. Chag HaSukkos, Shivas Yom, this Shivas Yomim make up the Yom Tov of Sukkos. That because you have the Sukkah, that's what makes them special. And from them first statement, as the Inyan of Atzim for Sukkos is Mitzvah Sukkos, we understand that the inherent aspect, the most fundamental aspect of Sukkos is the Sukkah. Because it's Sukkos is what makes it the Yom Tov. Chag HaSukkos, Tasalach Shivas Yomim. When it comes to the Dalet Minim, is their din ulakachtem lechem b'yom harishon pri'et tzadar, as in them yom harishon yom Sukkos. So when comes the mitzvah until Dalet Minim, that on Sukkos a Yom Tov that's already special because it's Sukkos, one of the details of what you have to do on this day is Netilas Daled Minim. It's the shaking of the lulav and esrog. Was von dem is muchach, as mitzvahs daled minim is nicht etzem yanef in yom shel Sukkos, dem Yom Tov. From this we understand that the daled minim is not the inherent aspect of Sukkos, it's something that's being done on Sukkos. The way the pasuk describes Sukkos, that the Yom Tov Sukkos is 7 days, seems to imply that the 7 days are made up by the Sukkah. That's what makes them what they are. And therefore we learn from this that the inherent element of Sukkos is Sukkah. On the Yom Tov Sukkos, one of the things we do is Daled Minim. But it's not the etzem of Sukkos, it's a prat in the Yom Tov Sukkos. Then noch der mitzvah for Netilas Daled Minim. Then later on in the pasuk, after it tells us about taking the Daled Minim, is a pasuk Mamshech Chashmachtam of Neshel Kechem Shivas Yamim. The mitzvah Simcha v'Chag Sukkos. Then the pasuk tells us Usmachtem, which is the mitzvah of Simcha. So there's 3 mitzvahs in Sukkah, on Sukkos. The mitzvah of Sukkah, the mitzvah of Lulav, and the mitzvah of Simcha. These 3 mitzvahs are going to correspond to the 3 concepts that we've been learning till now: mitzvah hayom, tshuva, and itzumi shel yom. Or in the opposite order, itzumi shel yom, which is Rosh Hashanah, tshuva, which is Yom Kippur, and mitzvahs, which is Sukkos. In Sukkos itself, you have these 3 things. You have itzumi shel yom, you have tshuva, and you have mitzvahs. And that's what he's going to explain in the next paragraph, the last one of Sivav, and then more at length in Siv Zayin. According to what we said before in Siv Hey, that you have Begolu Rosh Hashanah, Hachtaras HaMelech, and Yom Kippur you have Tshuva, and Sukkos you have mitzvahs, is verstandig, as the atzmistige Achtos von Eden mit den Nebischen Nefen von Kulachad will understand that the inherent Achtos of Yidden with the Eibishter in the manner of Kulachad, which is expressed in the Tam Nechuni Alechem Rosh Hashanah, Kumt Lidei Gilu in the Minyan Atzi von Sukkah. That is revealed in the inherent aspect of Sukkah. Therefore, the connection that you have through Tshuva, which is the primary concept of Yom Kippur, is expressed in a more revealed way in the idea of Lulav. And the connection between Yidden and the Eibus that comes through mitzvahs, where Nizgala in the mitzvah of Simcha von Sukkos will be revealed in the mitzvah of Simcha of Sukkos. So you have Tam Nichuni Aleichem, which corresponds to the mitzvah of Sukkah. You have Tshuva, which corresponds, or the connection through Tshuva, which corresponds with Lulav, and the connection through mitzvahs, which corresponds to the mitzvah of Simcha. How does it work? Tam Nichuni Aleichem, you might say we see it because we said it's Inyan Atzmi of Sukkos. But how do the other things connect? That is what he's going to explain in Siv Zayin, the connection between these 3 things, Tam Nichuni Aleichem and Sukkah, Tshuva and Yom Kippur, and mitzvahs and Simcha. Tshuva and Lulav, and mitzvahs and Simcha. Siv Zayin. Die Esbara Bazar. You get fear, as in the Inyan for Tam Nichuni Aleichem is talking Chilukun zwischen Eid und der Zweiten. We said before that when it comes to Tam Nichuni Aleichem, there's no difference between one Yid and another Yid. Which is why you see over here that every Seif where they ever built up these 3 concepts are all, each prat is important to flow from one to the next to get to our ultimate point. One of the things that we said in these 3 concepts, in the difference between these 3, is that the fact when it comes to Tam Nichuni Aleichem, there's no differentiation between one Yid and another Yid. That Inyan Kum B'Sukkos L'Degil in the mitzvah of Sukkah, which this idea is revealed on Sukkos, in the mitzvah of Sukkah. He says, "Call Yisrael Ruyin Leishim Sukkachas," the idea that all Yidden are worthy of dwelling in the same Sukkah. Alle Yidden an kein Chilukim, seine Masim zu Leishev Taduru zusammen in the Sukkah. All Yidden, without any differences, are befitting and worthy to dwell together in the very same Sukkah. So you see a connection between Tam Nichuni Aleichem and Sukkos and the idea of Achtos. That Tam Nichuni Aleichem, all Yidden are the same, and the Sukkah unites all Yidden together. B'negia Lulav state. Now, when it comes to Lulav, it says in Medrash, it's talking about Yidden and Goyim. Shakadosh Baruch Hu doneisen Yom Kippurim, which Eibishter judges them in Yom Kippur. They don't know who was victorious. Omar Hakadosh Baruch Hu, the Eibishter says, Tlu lulveichem b'yedchem, take your lulavim in your hands. So Yedu Akel Shat Mischisim B'din. Everyone will know that you were meritorious in the judgment of Yom Kippur. Thus says that the kapara from Yom Kippurim, that nikiv in his gala b'sukkos, that the atonement of Yom Kippur is revealed and recognized in Sukkos, in the mitzvah of Netilas Daled Minim, in the mitzvah of the Lulav. So we see a connection between Tshuva and Yom Kippur and the mitzvah of Lulav. Und die Mitzvah von Simcha Sachag, was ist ein Inyan von Simcha Shal Mitzvah. The mitzvah of Simcha of Sukkos, which is Simcha of Mitzvah. Das is der Gilui von der Skasos von Yidden zum Eibischen durch Mitzvahs. This reveals the connection of Yidden with Hashem through mitzvahs. Was ruft der Reis dit nur von Simcha bei Yidden, which mitzvahs call out from within the Yid, the approach of Simcha, as if Hashem, they are rejoiced in the mitzvahs that Hashem gave them. So we see the connection between Simcha and mitzvahs in general. So now, within Sukkot itself, just like we broke it down within Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, that there was the mitzvah Sayyim, there was Tshuva, and there was Itzumah Shel Yom, also Sukkot has these three things. Itzumah Shel Yom is the mitzvah of Sukkot, of Sukkah. The Tshuva is represented in the mitzvah of Lulav, which Lulav symbolizes the Zchiyah B'din of Yom Kippur, and the mitzvah Sayyim is Simcha, which represents the fact that Yidden are rejoicing in the mitzvahs that the Eibusher gave them. So now we have broken down these three concepts, a number of times. Number one, we looked at it in Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. There's the mitzvah Sayyim, there's Tshuva, there's Itzumah Shel Yom. We broke it down in the connection between the Eibusher and Yidden. Yidden are separate from Hashem that connect through mitzvahs. Yidden are closer to Hashem, but there still is a distinction, and Yidden are one with Hashem. We broke it down in the differences between that. There's when it comes to mitzvahs, there's every Yid is different. When it comes to tshuva, there's similarities, but there's still some distinction. And when it comes to Tamlichuni Aleichem, everybody's exactly the same. Then we broke it down, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkos, and here we started going the other way. Rosh Hashanah is Tamlichuni Aleichem, Yom Kippur is Tshuva, and Sukkos is mitzvahs. Then we broke it down in Sukkos itself, that Sukkos has a mitzvah of Sukkah, it has the mitzvah of Lulav, and it has the mitzvah of Simcha, and we connected that Tamlichuni Aleichem the mitzvah of Sukkah corresponds to Tamlichuni Aleichem. Over there, the Achdos of the Yidden is kulach in the manner of kulachat. The mitzvah of Lulav connects the Tshuva to Lulav Veichem B'yedchem, where if we were connect with this, we would connect earlier on. There is a closer Achdos of Yidden, but it's still not a full kulachat. And then the mitzvah of Simcha represents this kashrus through mitzvahs, which is different by everybody. And based on this, we're now going to answer our original question of the sukkah she'ula and the lulav she'ula, the borrowed sukkah, the borrowed lulav, that we cannot be yetzer of the mitzvah with a borrowed lulav, but we could be yetzer the mitzvah with a borrowed sukkah. And the way that Rabbi explained it earlier on, that sukkah has a unique characteristic that turns a borrowed sukkah into an owned sukkah. And how do we see that in B'pnim Yisrael Yonim will be in Simchas Ntas? Based on all this, we're going to now understand the difference between sukkah and lulav. Sukkah is der Gilui von Tamlichuni Aleichem. Was Eden seinen Einsach mit den Eibishten, since sukkah is the revelation of Tamlichuni Aleichem, where Eden and the Eibishter are one. Let's move on. Kenal as them is the Shaykh can look zwischen the mit der zweiten. So therefore, since you can't differentiate between the Yid and Hashem, you can't either differentiate between one Yid and another Yid. It says was Kol Yisrael Sukkah Achas. This means that the fact that all Yidden are worthy of dwelling in one Sukkah meant as Itzadim Ilui von Sukkah, because of the greatness of Sukkah, stehen Yidden in Ais Achtus Atzmis. All Yidden are in an inherent, essential oneness. But it's nicht wie zwei was in sich, not like two separate entities that become one. Nor wie alle Yidden zemen lechatchilu kulachat ein. All Yidden are to begin with one and only entity, one essence. Their father is their din in them. Therefore, the din is as a sukkah shulari kishalei, that a borrowed sukkah is as if it's his own. Unachmer says kishalei mamish. The Alter Rebbe says the word mamish. It's literally his own. But when the bald as a sukkah is me'achad al Yidden, since the sukkah unifies all Yidden into one entity, can man it upteilen? Ain't Eden from dem zweiten. We can't separate one Yid from another. Und sagen, as the sukkah is nicht shaloi, no dem zweiten. I say it's not your sukkah, it's someone else's sukkah. No, it's the sign of the enemies. It's his as much as the other person's. Because the whole idea of sukkah represents the oneness, that all Yidden are one thing. So my sukkah is your sukkah. Before we get to lulav, he points out in the brackets that gzula is an exception. Even though sukkah represents achtos, but if someone steals a sukkah, is that der mit gufem and nagid and says the achtos on sukkah. By doing that, he breaks and opposes the unity of the sukkah. By taking it away from someone else, he creates a crack, a separation in the oneness of sukkah. It's the nigzel between him and the person who he stole it from. Therefore it can't be shaloi, therefore you can't be yetzi mitzvah in a stolen sukkah. But a borrowed sukkah, since it's being done with permission, it's my sukkah as much as it's your sukkah, because we're all one and the same person. That only works by sukkah. When it comes to the daled minim, the four kinds, the four species, even though they too represent unity of Yidden, we're binding together all four types of Yidden. As it's known, the famous example that the four types, the four minim, represent four different types of Yidden. But however, this unification is in a way that they each retain their own identity, even after they are bound together as one. And here is going to show how that works because of the connection with Yom Kippur. And if you remember, we said by Yom Kippur, the Beit Shuvah, even though it's not as different as mitzvahs in general, but still each one retains their own way of doing Shuvah. Since, as we said, the mitzvah of Daled Minim reveals the kapara, the atonement of Yom Kippur. Just like when it comes to kapara, there are differences between one Yid and another Yid, even though the main idea of tshuva is beyond division. When every person implements tshuva in their own life, it's done on its own individual level. Is the achtos from the daled minim. So therefore, because daled minim are symbolized in the kapara of Yom Kippur, and by the kapara of Yom Kippur, each person implements it on their own level. Therefore, when it comes to the daled minim, there also is this idea that every one of the kinds retains its identity. And therefore you can't say, if somebody borrows daled minim, you can't say that it's like it's his. Well, in them because he still retained his own separate identity from the other person, even though he's bound together to the other person and he's unified with the other person, but he still retained his own identity. And therefore, if he borrows something from the other person, you can't say kishalei mamis because they're two separate people. Incredible. How we started out in an Indian nigla, Sukkah Shula, Lulav Shula, and by now understanding the kesher between Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkos, and the kesher between these mitzvahs, Sukkah and Lulav, to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, as they are, it actually explains to us the characteristics, the definition of the mitzvahs. That Sukkah is about kulachad. Mashenkin Lulav is achtos, but not kulachad, and therefore it actually has a halachic ramification that a borrowed sukkah you could use it for the mitzvah, and a borrowed lulav you can't. And actually, he says in the next paragraph, you see this hinted in the pasuk itself. This also explains why by lulav it says in the plural, and by sukkah it says loch in the single, in the individual. Yidden are one body, one unit. If you do one unit, you speak in the single, in the individual. But yet the end of our black when it comes to the daled minim, with every single one retains their own identity. It's just that they are being bound together. Then they become a plural. You speak to them because you're speaking to a group of individuals. Nevertheless, isn't them daled minim for dadrin achtos. There still is the idea of unity. We are still binding together and combining all these four kinds together. Now, then comes the third idea, the third mitzvah, which is the mitzvah of simcha. As we said before, it expresses the connection of Yidden to the Eibishter through mitzvahs. Und therefore, like we said before, by mitzvahs, everybody is on their own level, and therefore there is differences between Yidden. Und therefore, and therefore also in the simcha of Chag HaSukkos, there were differences between the different categories of Yidden, from Chassidim and Shemaisa Yamaraktim, the Chassidim and the great men of deeds who would dance during Simchas Beis HaSheva, and the people, the men and women who would come to hear and to listen, which were, there was many differences from the Chassidim and Shemaisa to the regular people. Each one expressed their simcha in a different way, because like we said before, by mitzvahs everybody expresses their own individualism, in their own individual level, and simcha of Sukkos represents the mitzvahs, and therefore it was expressed in a way where each person expressed their own individuality. So now we see that the three mitzvahs of Sukkos, each one corresponds to three different levels in the Achdus, either Kula Chad, or there's differences but they're bound together, or they're totally different. And that's why when it comes to the mitzvah itself, there is differences in the fulfillment of the mitzvah, that a Sukkah She'ula does work because Kula Chad, my Sukkah is your Sukkah. And by Lulav, my lulav is not your lulav, because even though we're ba'achtos, but we're still retaining our own identity somewhat, and therefore you have to own your own lulav.